So today we're going to go over the 3 activities from yesterday that were homework if you did not finish them in class. Activity 1 was the Brainpop, Activity 2 was the web quest, and Activity 3 was the Why Does Matter Matter Cami article. So we're going to go through them today. We're going to talk about the answers, some information behind them, and if you need to make corrections to any of your documents, you can go back and do that. I also did post the answer keys on Classroom. So you're basically going to be watching these Edpuzzles to review your answers, to make changes, and to turn them in. Don't forget that your homework tonight is to make sure that yesterday's Activity 4, which was the 2 Rocketlit articles, Matter Changes and It's Not Magic, It's Just a Phase, are done. If you finished both of those Rocketlit articles in class yesterday, then your homework for today is technically done already. If you didn't get a chance to do them yesterday, then that is your homework for today. So we're going to start with this Edpuzzle, which is going to go over the answers to the 2 Brainpop videos that you watched. The first Brainpop video was States of Matter, and it basically introduced the 3 main phases of matter and gave you some information about each phase, solid, liquid, and gas. Question number 1 said, all physical matter is composed of tiny particles called atoms. Okay, so atoms make up matter. Matter makes up everything. We've talked about that. Question number 2 said atoms behave differently depending on the temperature and pressure of their environment. Those are often referred to as the conditions or the physical conditions sometimes of the different states. And those 2 conditions that they actually talk about there are temperature and pressure. Number 3 said particles within a liquid move around and slide past each other pretty regularly, and they have a fixed volume but not a fixed shape. So that's one of the main characteristics of a liquid. They're always taking up the same amount of space, right? Whether they're in a graduated cylinder, a beaker, a pot, spilled on the table, they always have a fixed volume, but their shape does change to match the container that they're in or on. Number 4 says when you increase the temperature of water, the particles move faster and they begin to move apart. If you have spread apart or spread out, that would also be acceptable for number 4, but the particles move faster and they basically spread out. They fill up the entire space that they have. Number 5 said that gases don't have a fixed volume. If you put shape there, that's also acceptable. Gases don't have a fixed volume or a fixed shape. So in Brainpop, they were specifically talking about volume, but if you put shape, that would also be acceptable. And then number 6, it says solids have a pretty rigid structure, which means it's pretty set in stone. It's not really flexible or movable. And they also have a definite shape and a definite volume. And definite here basically means constant or unchanging. So that was the first Brainpop video. The second video was titled Matter Changing States, and that was basically explaining the different phase changes that happen as you move from a solid to a liquid to a gas, or through any of those states from one to the other. So the first question said, water changes states due to changes in temperature and pressure. So those are those same 2 conditions that we talked about in the first video, but its chemical properties remain the same. So in a phase change, you do not actually change the chemical composition of anything. If you have water, right, in its chemical composition form, that's H2O, right, 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. And if it's in its solid state, you have a chunk of ice, right, that's still just water, H2O. If you let that ice melt and change from a solid state to like a liquid state, a puddle, you still just have water. You still have H2O. So even though it went through a phase change or a change of state, the chemical properties, right, what it actually makes it up remains the same. And that kind of segues into question 2, which says that a state change or a phase change is a purely physical change. So this video introduces the concept of physical changes versus chemical changes, which we will explore more in the web quest and then also later on in this unit through notes and a lab. Question number 3 says molecules of ice are bonded tightly to one another in a structure called a crystal lattice. Solids have a very kind of rigid structure. All of their molecules are arranged in these kind of rows and columns that interlock. And so we call that a crystal lattice. Number 4, when a solid changes to a liquid, that is called melting. And the temperature at which this happens is called the melting point, which you might have seen in some of the phase change graphs in the WebQuest. Ice begins to melt at 0 degrees Celsius. The temperature stays the same until all of the ice has melted. So that's something that's interesting that happens during phase changes. The temperature will actually stay the same until the entire phase change has happened. And we'll see that when we look at our phase change graphs later this week. Number 6, when we add heat to water, its temperature rises until it hits the boiling point and the point where it starts turning into a gas, right? That's where we'd start to see things like steam. And then last but not least is 7. 7 is a phase change that you may or may not have heard of before. And this says sometimes substances change directly from a solid to a gas in a process called sublimation. The kind of classic real world example where you might have encountered sublimation before is dry ice. Dry ice sublimates and it goes from a solid directly into a vapor or a gas. So these are the answers for the activity number 1 from yesterday, the Brainpop. You should hopefully have all correct answers on your paper now that you can turn in. And that is the end of the first video for today.